I'm Giulia. I'm an esports psychologist and a performance coach. And actually, these two walk together, but I'm going to explain it a little bit so you understand the difference. Uh, Today, I'll be talking a bit about the importance of a good cognitive and emotional training on pro players. Just so you all understand, as a sports psychologist, I'm also able to work with esports. Everyone who works with sports are able to work with esports because we understand that all the areas that are needed for esports to be considered as sports are there. So there isn't a great difference between working with sports and esports for a psychologist. But for every different type of sport, you will need to learn its own specifics in terms of what kind of cognitive skills you're going to have to work on. And that will differ from game to game as well. But overall, um, I'm an I'm a sports psychologist, and the difference that I would say between being a sports psychologist and being a performance coach is that someone who isn't a psychologist can be a performance coach, but they can't be a psychologist, and a psychologist can't be a performance coach. The performance coach is only going to be focusing on enhancing performance, and the psychologists will be investigating with more depth in the person's mindset and in the group mindset as well. So when we talk about esports, what would be important cognitive skills for us to work on? As I mentioned before, it would depend a lot on the game. Some games, for example, uh, games such as FPS, you need to have more uh, eye-hand coordination. So in that sense, you're going to have to work with that player more towards that. And other games, you will need, for example, MOBAs. Although it's a very important skill set also in FPS, but in MOBA, you could specifically work on response time, for example. Um, and the interesting thing about esports differing it from traditional sports is that you're always going to have your your athletes in top shape mentally because first of all, uh, traditional sports, they're usually very physical, so that gives them the chance to put all of the hormones and energy out in the game. But when we're working with esports, we're working basically with the mind. They're doing very few movements, physical movements. So all of that hormonal charge will be within their bodies, and they need to be very emotionally prepared to deal with that. So cognitive skills, for example, are mental toughness. Mental toughness is usually related to many skill sets that actually make the person more resilient, actually, towards loss, towards also being more prepared for all the possible outcomes in dealing with that. So we also have concentrated attention and diffuse attention. In esports, we usually have more concentrated attention, where you have one specific stimulus to focus on, while in diffuse attention, you have to change focus to different stimuli. And usually we have more concentrated attention, but we also have to deal with diffuse attention. So we also got flow. Uh, a person or an athlete that's really concentrated, that is really feeling the game, they will have that sort of feeling that time is just passing, it's just flowing by. And that's kind of like what flow is. You sense a different time, you sense a different way of dealing with time, of dealing with your concentration. You're totally immersed in the game, and that's very important for competition, because if you're not into a state of flow, you're probably going to be uh, focusing a lot on your thoughts, and that's not really good for the game, because those thoughts can give you a lot of anxiety, for example, depending on how well prepared you are to deal with these thoughts. So motivation is also another cognitive skill. Eye-hand coordination, as I talked about, response time, and there are many, many other cognitive skills. Uh, for you to train them, that would depend a lot on, as I said, the game, also on how much of that you need in the game. Uh, if you need something specific that will give you an advantage towards other players, that is very important. It really depends on what that specific group, that specific team, or that specific player needs to work on. So it's very different for each case. So emotions, how do they interfere in the gameplay? This is very important, because this is not only about pro players, it can be also for streamers, it can also be for just casual players as well. So emotions, the best way for you to play is for you to have uh, a neutral sort of level where you can manage your emotions. We say that anxiety is good to a certain level, and not after that level it becomes negative, because anxiety is actually uh, a, a feeling that you get when you're preparing yourself to deal with something in the future. But if you have a lot of that, you can trigger a fight and flight mode, which is an internal mode that's actually uh, it's more it's more of a biological way for us to deal with threats. And that's the thing, you don't really have a threat in that moment. For example, you're not running away from a lion, you're not running away to defend your life or anything. So you're going to have that sort of release of hormones inside your body, and that will trigger many reactions. So it causes reduced attention, and that's not something you want, for example, in a competition. Uh, so instead of being able to focus on multiple targets, for example, your attention span gets shortened, and that actually interferes a lot in gameplay. Higher body tension. So when we're talking about, for example, eye-hand coordination, when you actually need to be more loose with what you're doing with your hands, for example, because you need to click the button fast so many times. If you're having a tense body, that might limit your movements. Higher risk of tilting and higher chances of having physical reactions. This is very interesting, because when we're talking about fight and flight mode, it's actually called fight, flight, or freeze mode, because that's what we're usually physically doing when this situation happens to avoid the threat. So that's when you have your heart beating a lot. So it can cause excessive sweating, and that might um, interfere with your eye-hand coordination. Your mouse is all sweaty, you're not being able to touch it properly. You can also get a headache, stomach aches. There isn't a worse moment where you can get stomach aches or diarrhea or anything like that than in a competition in the middle of gameplay. And anxiety and stress can actually cause that. And also tilt. We do have other emotions, but those two are the most important ones. And tilt is a sort of emotion that's talked about mainly in games where you can't move. For example, as poker, esports, as I talked about before. Um, in a lot of traditional sports, although you might get anxious and stressed out, and that can interfere in our performance, you're also releasing all of that energy uh, while you're running or doing some physical activities. But in esports, you aren't. So that's all being kept in your body. And yeah, so you have the possibility of tilting. And it would be considered the maximum of stress and tension in that situation. And you get a higher risk of aggression, which is something that you definitely want to avoid, especially in a competition. You can get banned for it, for example, and not only you can get banned for it, it also doesn't add anything to the game. Uh, Higher risk of frustration as well, so you can get a very frustrated player instead of being a player that can get to a level where they can regulate their own emotions. They are at the maximum of stress and tension. And we want to avoid that because that's a path that's almost not possible to return from at that moment in the middle of a competition, for example. So if you have a frustrated player, you're going to have a player that's also more likely to abandon the game. And so we talked about these characteristics, and I guess that it's easy to portray a bad player from those characteristics. Not necessarily a bad player, but bad attitudes and bad behaviors for them to have. But what abilities does a champion have? So I selected a few here. There are obviously other abilities, but it also it depends a lot on what game we're talking about. But I separated a few here. So one of the first ones would be they can manage their emotions in and out of competitions. Let's uh, let's talk about the fictional scenario here. If we talk about, for example, a player that's their team is losing a game, for example, and that person is getting very anxious, it's not going to help them to get in that state of mind. It's not going to help them at that moment to think, oh, we're losing, we're losing. What's going to happen then? What's going to help them to actually turn the game and perhaps have a chance of winning is to identify what's going wrong uh, and at that moment improve their communication. So they need to actually be able to acknowledge what's going wrong, and they can only do that if they're in a good state of mind. There are techniques for the player to get in a more neutral state of mind because I'm from a school in psychology which is called CBT, called cognitive behavioral therapy, and we work a lot with feelings, thoughts, and also behavior. And we do have a lot of techniques to deal with, for example, anxiety and stress. I don't know about other schools in psychology. I can talk about my practice So yeah, we would teach the player, for example, some techniques, and then they would be able to apply those techniques in a moment where they think it best fits. And for example, how would it be important for them to manage their emotions out of competitions? It's important for them because they need to manage their emotions during training, for example, dealing with fans, dealing with adversaries. And we in the esports business, we see a lot of people getting sometimes banned for the silliest things ever. For example, getting into an argument uh, with a fan or with a teammate, and that is just something that is not acceptable when you're a pro player. So second would be knows how to work in group and communicates well their needs. It is said, and I've read some research about it, that esports players, they tend to be more introverted, therefore they don't know how to work well in groups, and that can actually be true, especially when you compare to practice in other team sports. So when you have when you consider that you have, for example, uh, group sports such as basketball, football, or any other group sports, uh, usually they're working with teamwork ever since they're a kid. They're um, improving their practice since a very young age with coaches, with colleagues, and perhaps even other professionals. And esports usually tends to be something that's way less professional until you actually become part of a team, and that might actually not help in teaching these players, these future players, how to work in a group. So that's very important for them to have this ability, or for the psychologist or performance coach to work with that. Um, so a good player reviews and studies their performances. This is something that's extremely important because it also uh, goes along with the next option, which is works towards reaching goals, not only winning. So first of all, if you have winning as the only possible outcome in your mind, you will become frustrated. Not because you're a bad player if you don't win, but because there are many chances of you not winning because you don't know. You know what you're doing, you don't know what the other team members and what the other team is going to do. So the only thing you can actually control is what you're going to do. So if you work towards reaching personal goals, reaching team goals instead of winning, you will be most likely to win, and also most likely to not frustrate yourself. And then you have a next game, for example, you're feeling happier or at least more neutral and not frustrated, and that will not interfere badly in your next performance. So when you review and you study your own performance and the performance of your team, for example, if it's a group, you have a chance of actually fixing some of the mistakes you did, and also knowing where your weak spots are. And you can set goals for that. So instead of your goals being only related to winning, they can be also related to your own performance. And also, a champion trains hard, not only gaining skills, so not only with their game coach, but also in other areas that will enhance their performance. So this is very, very important. And not because I'm a psychologist, but with other many areas that work with esports, such as physiotherapy, nutritionists, um, physical PE, physical education as well. Now we know that, for example, sugar is horrible for the brain, especially before you're playing. So we have all of those ads, for example, for energetics, and it's full of sugar, and it's not something good for the players to have to ingest before a game, for example. So if they have all of this all of this multidisciplinary professionals working with them, a player knows how to get informations from them. I've worked with teams that there were players that didn't want to work with me, and then when they actually focused on it and saw they were getting better, they really went for it and trained really hard because they saw how much of a difference it made in their performance, and that is very, very important. And okay, so what does an esports psychologist do, or a mental coach? So we work firstly with psychoeducation. As I said, we have a lot of techniques, and there's no point for those techniques to be only in our sessions, for example, because we need to teach them something that will help them, for example, during competitions. So providing them the information and the support is very important because they need to understand what they're going through. So, for example, uh, how do you know if you're having an anxious moment? So there are so many signs, for example, such as your hand is sweaty, you're getting tense, your breathing is heavier, you're getting your focus is very narrowed. And by teaching them to acknowledge what they're having, then they know what kind of technique they can apply at that moment to reverse the damage that could be done by having that sort of reaction. The second thing would be group work. Group work, I would say, is my favorite part because it's the most fun part. Um, well, we usually tend to work with group dynamics, and these group dynamics, they actually give you a moment, give the players a moment to reflect on something. So we as psychologists, we observe the gameplay, we observe the training, and we see what's going on further than just what is being able to be seen during a game for a non-professional eye. So we observe how how the players are communicating between themselves, how their cognitive skills are working. If some player has difficulty in some emotional or cognitive skill, and then we can work that and also in group and give them a time to reflect, and not only tell them, oh, this is wrong, this is not going so well, but also give them a chance to reflect on it. So individual work, we also work with the players individually, and that's very important because, as I said, each individual has a different uh, set of skills that they need to work on, and that will be very specific to each individual. And also, we need to actually talk about some personal things that might affect in their gameplay. So if they're going, for example, through a family problem, a family issue, that will interfere a lot. I had a situation one of the members was trying to commit suicide, and that obviously interferes in the whole group dynamic, and it worries them, makes them more anxious. So needs to be dealt with individually as well, not only for players who have mental health issues, but also players who need this sort of support. The cognitive training, as I said, nowadays there are some apps where you can use. I recommend CogniFit. It's they have it on iPhone and an Android, so it's a very nice app I use, and it gives um, the sort of data that you need in terms of which ones they need to work on, which skill sets they need to work on, and that is for each cell phone, so they can just practice on their own. But there are other methods as well, such as biofeedback, which is when you connect your heart rates, for example, uh, and your breathing to play, and then you can see, and you can actually measure the anxiety levels, for example, in that person's body, and you can teach them what sets of techniques work best for them. So emotional management, which is kind of what we talked a lot about here, and performance enhancement. Performance enhancement really is everything here. We cannot just talk about one specific thing and say, oh, this enhances players' performance. No, like it's all of this. If you just work cognitively, for example, you're going to have a player who has a very sharp skill set of response speed and attention, but then if they get uh, unbalanced with their own emotions, then that's it. They're not going to perform well. So yeah, so an emotionally and cognitively well trained player has an enhanced performance. That's basically what we talked about today. There's some interesting questions that I've made myself that perhaps uh, you're wondering as well. So, does having does working emotional on your emotions and your cognition make you a champion? No, it does not make you a champion, but it does enhance your performance. Um, Making you a champion is something that doesn't only come from you, it also comes from external factors. So, if the adversary is much better than you, if they're also having an enhanced performance compared to yours, if your team is working well with you. So you may have, if you're on a group game, for example, you may have the best performance ever, but your team needs to follow up. Otherwise, you're just going to have one star, and that's not really what group work is about. And yeah, I think for me, it's that. These are my socials. Um, I'm gonna talk a little bit about my project before opening to questions. Okay, so just so you know, I'm from Brazil, as Isaiah said, and we launched last week. We actually launched a project for women. It's for now it's just in Brazil, but it's for women to be able to connect between themselves, and the main topic there would be games. So games, esports, and streams. and markets related to games in general, so they can find other women to play with. They can find jobs in the area. They can um, they can show themselves streaming, and everything is just more of a place to connect women and women through game. So if anybody is interested in knowing more about it, you can reach out to me. But overall, that's a little bit of what I have to bring to you guys. And I'd like to know if you have any questions. I don't know. Do we have any questions in other places? Okay, so we have workshop attendees, right? Okay. Okay. Um, you mentioned that tilt partially builds up due to esports competitions being most inactive. Therefore, if players starting to tilt, do you believe cardio or general exercise will get them off tilt? Um, but do you consider that to be a person that constantly tilts, or at that moment is tilting? Because, for example, if you're in a competition and you tilt, you're in the middle of the game. You can't really do anything about it in terms of cardio. You can't move, right? You can't just leave the game. So what we could do is, for example, are some breathing exercises. What happens is when you're on a high stress level, what, what we call the fight, flight, or freeze uh, reaction, you actually, let's say, unbalance all of your cardio and breathing, um, and you can go back to actually be on a more stable mode through breathing. Because if you consider, for example, all of these things that change in our body while we are at that moment, so breathing, hormones, and heart rate, there is only one that you can actually control, which is breathing. So through breathing and through breathing techniques, you can actually kind of tell your body that nothing is really going on in terms of threat to your life or danger. But there, to be honest, this would be more on a anxiety or stress level. The higher you get, the more your rational part of your brain shuts down, and it will be really hard to even remember to do these techniques. So if you constantly tilt, I would recommend you to look for a psychologist in general. It doesn't have to be a sports psychologist. First, understand how to deal with your emotions. Second, do breathing exercises in the first moments of anxiety or stress. And third, eat well, sleep well, increase your cortisol and adrenaline levels. So, hi, what are your thoughts on conflict management between players, especially those of younger age? I don't really understand your question. Is there anything specific? Some type of conflict? Would it be between players in the same group, players from different teams? But well, um, conflict is something that's very present in esports, especially in, okay, players in the same team. Okay, it's something that's very present, especially I believe in esports if they live in the same game house. Because or teenagers are they're problematic by nature. I would say they're in a stage where they're actually um, developing many different things, and that definitely does interfere with their own behavior. And yeah, as I said, it's very different for you to deal with esports players because there are many different things you have to consider. So for once, you have to consider if they live in the same house, because that's actually it's something I'm totally against, because you should have a game office, for example, but not a game house. If it's tough to live with your parents, it's even tougher to live with people you don't know and you have to work with. So that can actually interfere a lot. Any conflict in household can actually interfere a lot in the gameplay. So a good thing is not only to have a game office, for example, it's also to deal with the conflicts. There aren't only conflicts between players. For example, I've had many conflicts between players and coaches, players and um, I don't know, the manager, for example. So you need to identify the people who are involved in the conflict. You need to provide a safe space for them to talk about that and solve the issue. You can be a mediator, for example, and communication helps a lot. I worked in group cohesion as well. So I worked on a team where they constantly had fights because they just changed to a game house that was very far from their own states. It was very isolated, and none of the guys knew each other. But when we started developing the group cohesion, I didn't even need to interfere anymore in the issues, because they would apologize or they would solve the conflict right away and not wait for a third party to be involved. So that's also something that you would want to teach them in terms of conflict management. Um, is there a way for amateur teams to measure breathing plus heart rate of players to measure anxiety? Um, I don't think you can actually measure heart rate. Um, but so first, I would say there's actually some techniques that I can uh, try to post and send it to you guys. I would recommend you to do a breathing exercise while you train. So you train yourself also to have that sort of regular breathing cycle um, while you play, because training is playing, right? I mean, when you're in a competition, there's the event factor going on. But if you train, such as you train your skills, you will get better for the competition. So it's basically the same thing if you train your breathing. I think that a good way for you to measure your breathing during a game would be to put, I don't know, like a microphone close where you can record. You can record your game and record that specific microphone and see and um, evaluate how you're breathing in more tense moments, for example. And also, I think it's good for you to do that, not only for breathing, but also to see how your communication is going, because there are a lot of people that in moments of higher stress, they start harassing their teammates. They start being aggressive towards their teammates, and that is definitely a problem. So they should evaluate their own behavior. Did you always want to work in esports, or did you start in psychology and then transition to this position? And that's a really good question. I got in my university saying that I wanted to do everything but sports. So I was never a sports fan, to be honest. I'm going to be very, very honest. I would say at that time I thought sports were a bit stupid. So I had that very, very narrow vision of sports. I didn't have any sort of connection to sports. And so when I was having the I had the luck to go to one of the universities here who actually have a period only of sports psychology. And when I had that period, I had the luck to also go to a final of League of Legends here in my city. And then I was just amazed because I love technology and it was so colorful and there were a lot of people dressed up. And I just thought it was so interesting at that moment, you know? And I started researching more about it. And I really had the luck to, I really had the chance to work on esports because my professor was really nice. So she she was very open for us to work with other areas, and that's how it started working with with esports psychology, and I just loved it. Um, and okay, okay, yes, Gigi, thank you for yeah, thanks for helping out with that question. Yeah. Um, why did you decide to start a platform for women in the gaming esports market to connect? Okay, so as a woman in gaming myself, and especially in esports, there are several things that should be considered in that question. So for women, there's a lot of harassment, and it's an issue we've been talking about for a long time. But for me, it was also connected to being a woman plus a psychologist. A lot of people don't understand the importance of a psychologist in this space. And also being a woman, it felt like a double challenge to me. Um, so it's been quite a while that I haven't been with the team. So it's been over a year or so. I've been working with esports and in other areas, but just a personal situation. The last team that I was in was more of something related to psychology, but the last team I had to get out of it because I was harassed and by the coach and also by the owner. Um, so that's something that isn't acceptable at all. I I love the area. I want to keep working on it, but it's just not plausible, and it's not. We're not being able to work actually if we're just being constantly devalued and harassed. I don't really know whether that is a question just of the Brazilian esports market, if it's a matter of a Latin American market. I don't really know, but what I can guarantee the men and women and everyone who's here is that we do definitely need to work on it worldwide. There are some places that may be less worse than others, but in general, almost every woman that has been a player or in the esports industry has suffered something. So yeah, so that's the reason why I decided to start a platform for women in this area, because I believe that we're very disconnected to each other. It's very hard to find other women to support you in this situation. It's very hard to find other women to play with you when you want. Um, and a lot of women just don't, they mute themselves, or they don't use girly characters or something. And that's very sad, because we just want to have fun. So that's really what it was about. Uh, so, what should managers, coaches, or players do if a player is feeling a severe lack of motivation? Um, so, first of all, motivation is a very broad, it involves a lot of things. So, lack of motivation may be due to a depression, for example, or it may be due to a personal problem, or it may be due to a career problem. So the first thing is really you have to identify what's going on. And I would highly recommend you to get that player, talk to someone who's specialized in behavior and feelings, so a psychologist. I would highly recommend you to get that player to see a psychologist, because um, it may be many things, including the fact that that person doesn't see gaining to be their life goal or something. And as a manager or a coach or a team member, you also need to learn to respect if that's that person's choice. I mean, they may be the best player in the world, but if they don't want to do it, then also need to acknowledge that and respect that. So I would say, really just get that person to speak to a professional. It may be something more serious as a depression, or it may be something related specifically to the team, or to the game itself. Yeah, on my part, that's it. Thank you guys so much. It was very fun talking to you. The questions were actually really, really good. And yeah, that this was a very nice moment for me. It's been a while since I've last actually done a presentation about psychology, sports psychology. And I'm very glad that you all liked it.